can't be sustained. The fall of housing construction can't be reversed because it was premised on giving houses away to anybody that wanted one, whether they could pay or not pay. And so the massive bubble in housing construction, which took construction to more than about 2.5 million units per year, and now we're at about 800,000 units per year, can't be stoked up again because that's not a financial problem anymore. That's a problem of the fact that we were using society's resources, in that case in terms of housing construction, in a way that can't be put whole again. It is the Humpty Dumpty of the real economy. It's not a technical fix anymore. It's that the economy was allocating financial resources, many of which were coming from the $700+ billion we were borrowing from abroad, to build things, buy things, finance things for which that market demand can no longer continue. Ideally, the smooth way out of this would be that households that overborrowed so dramatically based on easy credit, on teasers, and on the belief that their high market values were here to last, would cut their consumption, and that would be smoothly balanced by a rise of other kinds of spending in the economy. For example, a rise of exports. That would be a natural kind of adjustment. It's not impossible. In fact, there has been some export increase, but it depends on the rest of the world not following us down in the downward spiral right now. For instance, in China, making an independent fiscal expansion to keep domestic demand in China high so that the decline of exports to the U.S. doesn't trigger a multiplier whereby China slows and then they buy even less from the U.S., and rather than our exports compensating, we find our exports falling at the same time as our consumption is falling. That's the real risk now of the real economic multiplier. We have to balance demand. The other way to balance demand would be to increase investment spending. But which firms are going to be able to increase investment when credit conditions are so fraught? Well, it would have to be the government, would be the only place where we could get real investment increasing. That's possible. That's what Barack Obama is talking about when he says that we need to use this opportunity to rebuild infrastructure and increase government expenditure in the economy. But making this happen smoothly is beyond the tools that we have. And the chances of the downward spiral, whereby our slowdown infects other economies, comes back to greet us as further declines of exports, is all too real unless we find the capacity to have global coordination of macroeconomic policies. It's not impossible, but it is profoundly hindered by the fact that we haven't had a government, probably in about 3 years, that functions, and we don't have a presidency anymore that functions, and we're having to wait for a new administration to come in to be able to carry out effectively the kinds of leadership that could guide decision-making in a serious and long-term way. I want to end with a thought also that George Soros, I think, has more brilliantly expounded than anybody. Of all of George's books, well, I like many of them. Alchemy of Finance, I thought, was fabulous. But the book that I thought recently was absolutely stupendous, underappreciated but profoundly important, was The Bubble of American Supremacy. Because the idea there was the displacement of ideas wasn't only about housing or even about market fundamentalism. It was about the role of the U.S., the nature of U.S. society and its role in the world. And that bubble is also bursting right now. The idea that we do need global coordination is a fundamental lesson of our time right now. Of course, it's not only coordination in macro policy, but in so many other areas. we're actually sitting on top of massive intellectual bubbles in many areas right now. We've gone through a period of deep unreality on many, many issues. We have the same bubble with regard to the physical environment, with regard to climate change, the belief that everything is all right, that we can just go on as usual, that there are no hard landings, that there's no abrupt nonlinearities. Our scientists would tell you that exactly the same kinds of crashes in the financial sector will happen in the biophysical and the geophysical sector because they are also subject to extremely sharp nonlinearities when thresholds are hit, and the same kind of amplifying positive feedbacks when species start to die or drying takes place in a location and that triggers a release of methane from the peat or carbon release from the soils, amplifying the human impacts. We've been living in the same kind of everything's all right, we don't have to do anything but get rich philosophy in so many areas. Also how we treat the poor in the world. The neglect of the world's poor in this context will sometime, it's already happened, one could say, but it stands also to be a great amplifier. We've punished the poor in multiple ways with climate change, with massive environmental degradation, now with a huge financial crisis which visits them from the outside with an ethanol policy which is a disgrace, which ramped up world food prices dramatically, to which we could have cared less in our society when all the evidence pointed to extreme duress of more than 1 billion people because of our policy of putting more than 1/3 of our maize into our gas tanks. We've taken a view that nothing matters because all we have to do is say things are going on okay as they are, what are you worried about? And the basic point I want to make about this problem of that George has pointed to, and let me just end here. What both George and Nouriel have pointed to is the discrepancy of what you see on the surface, for example, in the Dow or a bond rating, and what you see in the underlying mechanisms. George Soros has made more money than we can count because he's paid attention for a lifetime to the difference of the fad and the reality. That's, as I understand it, the whole basis of both his theory and his method. And so he can say, if I'm so smart, why aren't you rich? He's proved that this is a method that works for 30 years. Now, what I know about our training since the early 1980s, I think Nouriel and would confirm this, the way we train people to think has left them almost in mainstream economics, I would say, and I would say in mainstream politics, has left them almost unable anymore to distinguish the surface from the underlying reality. Because not only was it a philosophical, not only was it the age of Reagan and the beginning of market fundamentalism that came in the early 1980s and the rational expectations revolution and all the rest, but a fundamental break in how we actually train our students to think. I hope not the way I'm trying to do it, but the way that we see it in our universities. Because the new kind of economic modeling, for example, for 25 years, the one that won all the Nobel Prizes, said, you don't have to understand the deep picture. You have to look at the prices you see on the surface and infer the deep picture from that. In other words, the surface tells you the depth because the surface and the depth couldn't be two different things. You don't really have to know underlying mechanisms in the economy because the prices reflect the underlying mechanisms. In fact, you fit the deep model